Hello you lovely people, Jules here for WhatCulture.com, and today I want to talk to you about something a little bit different, because usually I'm here to dole out the lists to you each and every day that I jump into the recording studio, but today I want to talk about something that's actually near and dear to my heart, and that is the concept of JRPGs. Now this is the thing, I am a huge fan of the genre, having been basically raised on the likes of the Final Fantasy series, Dragon Quest, and everything in between. So what I thought I'd do today with the help of Greg Hicks is take a look at the evolution of the JRPG, tracking where it's come from and where it is today. So settle in, grab a drink, let's have a chill time. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and this is the evolution of the JRPG. So the Eastern-styled role-playing version of this genre had been treading ground on home consoles since the 1980s, yet it took venturing new IPs out into the overseas markets to actually earn the term JRPG and start to gain any traction. The first wave to break new ground and expectations aplenty in Japan weren't actually the Final Fantasy games as many think, but a little title known as Dragon Quest. Bolstered by an art collaboration with Dragon Ball creator Akira Toriyama, this was cited as a game changer for how narrative and storytelling could be delivered on consoles. The success of the series saw the rise of many others in its wake, including Square's first and thankfully not last Final Fantasy, as well as Sega's Phantasy Star series. What a joy. Whilst the first two may have walked familiar story beats with creatures based on myth and folklore commonly associated with dragons and dungeons in that order, for legal reasons, Sega went with a spacefaring galaxy-spanning adventure instead. Rather than being seen as fierce competition, this steady wave allowed new publishers to also break into the scene, such as Capcom with the first Breath of Fire in 1993 and Atlus with Shin Megami Tensei a year prior. If the latter sounds familiar to some, it's because it's become the massively popular Persona series, which is an offshoot of SMT. But while Sega was still going strong with their efforts, the Super Nintendo became the popular choice for both continuations and new series to take root. In the early 90s saw a steady period of success for the JRPG, but by the midpoint of the century, developers were looking to expand on their visions. Hybrid action RPGs like Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger, and Terranigma were pushing the SNES to its limits, and therefore it was time for something new. And that something arrived in the form of the Sony PlayStation, and to a lesser extent, the Sega Saturn. Whilst the latter was home to a few decent ports like the Luna series and Grandia, it was Sony's first foray into consoles that saw the JRPG take massive leaps into what bigger advancements in technology could do for the genre. While some developers were still playing it safe with 2D sprite-based RPGs with just a dab of 3D like Capcom with Breath of Fire, and Konami's oft-revered Suikoden or Suikoden series if you want to get anal about it, others were pursuing this new dimension with absolute gusto. Game Arts and Ubisoft ported their 2D/3D hybrid Grandia over for larger success, but there was just that little something that was missing for the genre to explode at this point. With the new technology, saw more scope from developers to tell their stories, as the standard fantasy tropes were beginning to evolve into something much more. Suikoden was based on a Chinese fable about warring states, whilst Sony's own Wild Arms looked to the Wild West for its story inspiration. Developers were also looking to branch out both in story and scope, and this was the format to do it on. All it needed was one killer title to lift the lid on this style of turn-based, story-focused gaming. Enter Squaresoft, now the Square Enix that we know and sometimes loathe. Now, it had already been dominating the market with their Final Fantasy series, as well as their aforementioned Mana titles as well, and Chrono Trigger to boot. They had definitely proved that they had the chops for this particular style of gaming and its hybrid offshoots. But what else could they do? Where else is there to go when you're sat comfortably at the top of an equally comfortable genre? Well, if you've got the inclination for it, you gamble. You put all your eggs into one basket, push all your efforts into just one more title, and hope and pray that it hits the spot for gamers and critics alike. And that title was Final Fantasy VI. No, it's Final Fantasy VII. Even though the purist in me says that it's Final Fantasy VI, it definitely was Final Fantasy VII that took this series and the JRPG concept as a whole completely mainstream. It might sound hyperbolic to say that this took the world by storm, but you only need to look at any list or ranking system to see it riding high at the top. To this day, you only need to look at the numbers, the companion pieces, and obviously the remake that's going on, and Lord knows how it's going to end and in how many parts, to realise the impact that this game had. If JRPGs were kind of like water held behind a dam, idly building up behind the proverbial barrier, then Final Fantasy VII was the game that broke that wall. The flood that followed was insane, and the genre reached loftier heights than all previous console generations combined. Squaresoft continued with a few more numbered Final Fantasies, including some of the best ones, such as Final Fantasy IX, and to a lesser extent Final Fantasy VIII, as well as the sequel to the much beloved Chrono Trigger in Chrono Cross. Before that, we saw the massively ambitious anime-inspired Xenogears, which took on such a complex range of themes and issues that it actually needs a retrospective in itself. Hint, hint. Yet it wasn't just the presentation side of the genre that got this big shake-up, as developers saw new ways to expand on the now familiar turn-based battle systems that we'd actually started to get a bit bored of. Hybrid action/adventure games like Vagrant Story and Parasite Eve, again Squaresoft titles, saw variants of JRPG systems put to work in their respective games, often to great success. It'd be fair to say that Squaresoft dominated the market at this point, but it wasn't actually just them. Konami continued with its Suikoden series, with its second entry in 1998 heralded as one of the best RPGs, and say it with me kids, of all time, whilst Enix brought over their beloved Star Ocean series to the PlayStation. Considered the golden age of this genre, the PlayStation played host to many a series both new and established. The use of full motion video for cutscenes, the capacity to spread epic stories over multiple discs and push graphical powers to its limit had people wondering what possibly could be next in line for the JRPG. So at the turn of the century, it'd be fair to say that both Sony and the JRPG were riding high, the former with its substantial catalogue on its first console, as well as making ground with the PS2, and the latter with what it could bring on the next evolution of consoles. But it wasn't just Sony though, as Sega's next foray, the Dreamcast, saw some killer titles in the form of Skies of Arcadia and a timed exclusive sequel to Grandia. But Sega, for all their faults, wanted to go in a different direction. Because remember that Phantasy Star title I mentioned earlier? Well, whilst the early days of the series may not be familiar to all of you, you may have heard of Phantasy Star Online. Because you see, this Dreamcast title and its sequel are considered the first proper online JRPGs, and with good reason. Again, like the genre that bore them, it took the focus away from the westernized, PC-centric nature of online gaming and brought that luxury to the home console. The Dreamcast may not have had the longevity, but it certainly had the innovation. But the market for that format was definitely in PlayStation's favour. The Eastern audience wasn't very receptive to Microsoft's flagship console, the Xbox, and as such, it stuck to more Western RPGs. It did have some corkers that borrowed elements of JRPGs, such as BioWare's Jade Empire, as well as ports of the aforementioned Phantasy Star Online, but all eyes were on Sony to deliver the next step. To which they did to an extent. Here on the PS2, we saw the 10th iteration of the ironically named Final Fantasy land in 2001 to, well, mixed reviews, I guess. It was still pretty highly reviewed, but not as good as any of the previous ones, as well as continuations from the Dragon Quest, Suikoden, and Star Ocean stables. The Shin Megami Tensei spin-off Persona was also gaining traction at this point, with the third installment releasing to critical success alongside its forebear. Yet, by the early 2000s, turn-based combat was becoming stale. Whilst games like Vagrant Story and Parasite Eve were smash hits on the previous PlayStation, the notion of any kind of sequel quietly dropped off into obscurity and rumour. Long-running Capcom series Breath of Fire effectively killed itself with its fifth title Dragon Quarter by being too divergent from the norm. Whereas hybrid adventure/RPG series Dark Cloud came and went with just 2 titles. People wanted innovation, but clearly they also feared a dramatic change. Something needed to happen, something obscure and random, something as random as a chance meeting in an elevator. Following a discussion with Final Fantasy's Sakaguchi and Square's Shinji Hashimoto about creating a new type of 3D adventure, the latter actually just happened to share an elevator ride with a Disney executive one fateful morning. Alright, maybe it's not actually that coincidental, as both companies did share the same building, but still, it was a pivotal meeting nonetheless. The concept of the wealthiest animation studio and the biggest publisher of JRPGs combining forces seemed like a pretty odd choice at the time, but it soon became one of those so goddamn crazy it might just work notions that indeed did pay off for both. Pairing Disney's most recognizable characters and worlds with that of Squaresoft's skill in the market paid off for both companies, as Kingdom Hearts has gone on to be a multi-million-dollar series. The story may have been a bit convoluted, but the simplified action/adventure hybrid with some RPG elements made it accessible for newcomers to get into this kind of game, which actually unfortunately also began to mark the decline of the genre. As we then stepped into the next generation of consoles, namely Sony's PlayStation 3 and Microsoft's Xbox 360. By the way, that's not me saying that Kingdom Hearts killed the JRPGs for the hardcore, but it was, for many, the writing on the wall that they've been ignoring to this point. And this is the thing, if you ask anybody to name 10 JRPGs for the PlayStation 1 and 2, that will actually be pretty easy enough. Yet try and ask them the same for the PS3 and Xbox 360 combined, and I guarantee that you'll see a few blank faces. That's not to say that there weren't any, but in the wake of this interactive movie mode and cover-based shooting boom that we saw on these consoles, JRPGs definitely suffered the brunt. You got a few games like the Persona and Tales of series, but many had switched to a faster paced, almost action style of gaming. The Xbox tried to recapture the old spirit with Lost Odyssey, which was actually helmed by none other than Mr. Final Fantasy himself, Hironobu Sakaguchi, but despite rave reviews, it actually failed to launch any type of sequel on the Xbox in the East. We also got Studio Ghibli, the animation powerhouse behind such classics as Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke, which teamed up with Level 5 to create the wonderful Ni no Kuni games. And while the first proved to be a smash hit for the PS3, this was a much more accessible level of JRPG. And while it would be very unfair to say that by this point the more traditional JRPG had died out, by the time that the PS4 and Xbox One came onto the scene in the noughties, you'd be hard pushed to find anything reminiscent of the glory days. All signs instead were pointing to a decline that we'd actually come to expect for the Eastern style of RPG. Indeed, now if you were to search PS4 JRPGs, you'll see the likes of Bloodborne and Nier Automata Potato Patata in your results, making the evolution painfully clear. Gaming-centric notions of what we considered a JRPG some 20 years ago have been amalgamated into the faster, action-paced titles that we know today. Even comparing Final Fantasy XV to any of its PS1 predecessors shows a market change in how they are played. Now, some elements remain, but barring the consistent efforts of Persona and Dragon Quest, tastes have considerably altered, and probably are not going to go back anytime soon. That's not to say that the genre isn't gone or done for, nor is it dormant, as evidenced by the earlier mention of the Final Fantasy VII remake, but again, that was changed dramatically to fit today's audience. But there are glimmers of hope. Look at Eiyuden Chronicle, which has amassed a whopping $4.5 million on Kickstarter. That proves the kind of dedication, the lasting impact that the JRPG has had on people over the years. And yes, we do see some remasters and some ports, as well as spiritual successors and tributes that pop up along the way. Grandia saw a port of its first 2 games on the Nintendo Switch, whilst 3DS newcomer Bravely Default is seeing one too. Octopath Traveler, also seen on Switch, harks back to a familiar time, JRPGs from the last century. So indeed, the format isn't dead, but it never will reach the highs that it once did. And instead, it's just evolved into what it is today, something that's faster, more action-focused, but can still hit those dramatic, emotional narratives that made us fall in love with the genre in the first place. And there we go, my friends. That was the evolution of the JRPG. I hope that you enjoyed that, my friends, and please let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below. If you want to chat to me further about all things to do with video games, TV, film, wrestling, anything else, you can do so over on Twitter at RetroJ0, or you can swing by Live and Let's Dice. It's my personal gaming channel where I stream every single Wednesday and Sunday. I hope you have a fantastic day, whatever you get up to, my friends, and treat yourself with love and respect, because you bloody well deserve it, and don't let anyone or anything else tell you otherwise. Go out there and smash it, you big ledge. As always, I've been Jules. You've been awesome. Never forget that. I'll speak to you soon. Bye.